"If you look at me like that again," the mafia boss murmured. She thought he was teasing until the truth hit. The bowl of clam chowder seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. It was a thick, creamy white, dotted with chunks of potato and flecks of thyme, a small universe of warmth and comfort. For Lena, it was the last order of the night, the final act in a long, wearying shift. For the man on the floor, the man whose boot had just shot out and sent her sprawling, it was a punctuation mark. The bowl tilted, a slow, inevitable surrender to gravity. Then it shattered. White-hot soup exploded across the worn linoleum, across the front of Lena's clean apron, scalding her skin through the thin fabric of her uniform. The ceramic fragments skittered away like frightened insects. The man, Grimes, laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a wet, ugly noise, full of jagged edges. It was the sound of a man who enjoyed the sharp crack of something breaking, especially when that something was a person's dignity. "Clumsy," he sneered, his voice booming in the suddenly silent diner. "You should watch where you're going." He had grabbed her arm as she fell, a cruel anchor, and his fingers were still digging into her bicep. The pressure was a hot, sharp pain that radiated up to her shoulder, a counterpoint to the spreading burn on her stomach. Lena didn't make a sound. She knelt there, on the floor of the lamplight diner, surrounded by the wreckage of her last order, a prisoner of his grip and his gaze. The entire room was frozen. The clatter of cutlery had ceased. The low murmur of conversation had vanished. There was only the hum of the old refrigerator and the ragged sound of Grimes's breathing. He leaned in closer, his breath a foul mix of stale coffee and malice. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" He had no idea. He had no idea that the quiet man in the corner booth, the one who looked like a simple construction worker nursing a black coffee, was her husband. He had no idea that man's name was Arthur. And he had no idea that Arthur had once dismantled entire criminal empires with nothing more than a quiet word and a single, perfectly timed phone call. He was enjoying his moment of power, blissfully unaware that his entire world was about to be unwritten. To understand the silence that followed, the profound and terrible stillness that was about to descend upon the lamplight diner, you have to go back. Back 3 hours, to when the evening was still soft and the diner was a haven. The lamplight was a small place, a relic from a time when chrome and vinyl were the height of fashion. It smelled of frying bacon, old coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of the lemon cleaner Lena used on the countertops every night. It was a place of quiet routines and familiar faces. Lena moved through it like a ghost, a whisper of grace and efficiency. Her feet made almost no sound on the checkered floor. Her hands were never still, refilling a sugar dispenser, wiping a smudge from the glass of the pie case, delivering a plate with a smile that was genuine but distant, as if a part of her was always somewhere else. She was a woman built of quiet resilience. There was a story in the guarded watchfulness of her eyes, a history in the way she held her shoulders, straight and proud, even when exhaustion settled deep into her bones. Her past was a locked room, and she had thrown away the key, choosing instead to build a new life in the simple, predictable rhythm of the diner. In the corner booth, the one with the cracked red vinyl that nobody else liked, sat Arthur. To the other regulars, he was just Lena's husband, a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, with hands that looked like they could crush stone, but were always gentle when they touched his coffee cup. He wore faded jeans and thick-soled work boots. A web of faint white scars crisscrossed his knuckles. He would show up an hour before her shift ended, every single night, and just sit. He would read a worn paperback or simply watch the rain trace patterns on the window. But mostly, he watched Lena. It wasn't a possessive gaze or a jealous one. It was the look of a watchman on a tower, a guardian standing vigil. It was a look of profound, aching tenderness. He saw not just the waitress, but the woman who hummed off key when she thought no one was listening, the woman who arranged the salt and pepper shakers into perfect alignment, the woman who had taught him how to breathe again. Sometimes she would catch his eye across the room. A private smile would pass between them, a silent conversation that no one else could hear. Tonight, she had caught him staring, his book forgotten in his lap, a soft, unguarded look on his face. She'd paused by the coffee machine and raised an eyebrow, a playful challenge. He had smiled back, a rare, full smile that transformed his rugged face, and murmured to himself, a phrase from their early days. "If you look at me like that again." She knew the rest of the sentence. "I might just have to believe I deserve you." It was their joke, their promise. A reminder of the fragile peace they had built together. A world away from the man he used to be. A world away from the noise, and the violence, and the ghosts. The peace was a delicate thing, a thin sheet of glass. And at precisely 9:17, Sergeant Grimes, formerly of the city's police department, kicked the door open and shattered it. He didn't so much enter the diner as invade it. The little bell above the door gave a startled, frantic jingle. Grimes let the door swing shut behind him with a loud bang that made old Mr. Hemlock, a retired history professor reading in his usual booth, jump and spill tea on his book. "Service!" Grimes boomed, his voice too loud for the small space. He was a man who took up more room than his physical size warranted. He had a thick neck that bulged over the collar of his security guard uniform, a cheap, ill-fitting thing that strained at the buttons over his belly. His face was florid, a permanent mask of irritation and entitlement. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who had once held real power and was furious that it had been taken away. He had been fired from the force 6 months ago. An internal affairs investigation. Excessive force. The details were murky, whispered about in places like this, but the result was clear. He'd traded a badge and a gun for a polyester uniform and a flashlight, guarding a half-empty strip mall. The demotion had curdled something inside him, turning his arrogance into a volatile, simmering poison. Lena felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She knew his type. The world was full of men like Grimes, men who measured their own worth by how small they could make others feel. She picked up a menu and a glass of water and walked toward his table. She kept her steps even, her expression neutral. This was the armor she wore every day. Politeness, professionalism, an unbreachable wall of calm. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Welcome to the lamplight." Grimes didn't even look at her. He snatched the menu from her hand and scanned it with a theatrical sneer. "Lamplight, what a dump." Lena said nothing. She placed the glass of water on the table, her movements precise. From his corner booth, Arthur watched. His body didn't move, not a single muscle twitched, but a profound change occurred within him. The quiet husband receded, and the watchman took his place. His eyes, which had been soft with affection moments before, became hard and flat, like chips of slate. He was no longer seeing a diner. He was assessing a threat landscape. The exits, the other patrons, the man's posture, the way his right hand kept twitching, a phantom limb reaching for a service weapon that was no longer there. Grimes tossed the menu onto the table. "Coffee, black, and make sure it's fresh. Last time I was here, it tasted like battery acid." He had never been there before. Lena knew it. Arthur knew it. But she just nodded. Right away. She returned with a fresh pot, the dark liquid steaming. She poured a cup with a steady hand, the aroma rich and earthy. Grimes picked it up, took a loud, slurping sip, and slammed it back down. Coffee sloshed over the rim, forming a dark pool on the table. "It's burnt," he declared to the room at large. "Can't you people even make a decent cup of coffee?" A young couple in a nearby booth stopped talking and looked down at their plates, suddenly fascinated by their half-eaten burgers. The cook, a burly man named Sal, paused at the pass-through window, his spatula dripping grease, a frown creasing his brow. This was the first test. The first microaggression. A probe to see how much disrespect the environment would tolerate. Lena met his challenge with the same unshakable calm. "I'm sorry to hear that. I can make a fresh pot if you like." Her refusal to be baited, her sheer professionalism, seemed to infuriate him more than any argument would have. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. Her composure was a mirror, and in it, he saw his own pathetic bluster reflected back at him. "Don't bother," he grumbled. "Just get me a steak, medium rare, and if it's even a little bit pink in the middle, I'm sending it back." "Of course," Lena said, writing it on her notepad. She turned and walked away, her back straight. Grimes watched her go, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. This was his stage now. The quiet diner was his audience, and he was the star of this miserable little drama. He felt the familiar thrill of control, the intoxicating rush of holding a small room captive with the force of his personality. This was power. This was what he missed. In his corner, Arthur's hand rested on his thigh. His fingers were perfectly still. He was a master of patience, a man who understood that true power was not in the first move, but in the last one. He had built his entire life on that principle. He knew that men like Grimes were engines of their own destruction. All you had to do was give them enough road. The tension in the diner became a physical thing, a thickness in the air. The other patrons ate their food mechanically, their gazes averted. They were all unwilling participants in Grimes's performance. They were the chorus, their silence a form of fearful complicity. They wanted him to leave. They wanted the peace to return. But no one was brave enough to say a word. Fear was its own kind of cage. Sal cooked the steak perfectly. He was a proud man, and he wouldn't let some loudmouth bully compromise his craft. He plated it with a scoop of mashed potatoes and a handful of green beans, and placed it under the heat lamp. Lena picked up the plate. As she approached Grimes's table, he deliberately stuck his leg out into the aisle. She saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift of his weight. She adjusted her path, stepping around his outstretched foot without breaking stride. It was a small, graceful movement, a dancer's pivot. She placed the plate in front of him. "Your steak, sir," she said. Grimes's eyes narrowed. He had been denied his little victory. He had wanted her to stumble, to create a scene. Her grace was an insult. He picked up his knife and fork and sliced into the steak. He chewed a piece with exaggerated deliberation, his jaw working. Then he spat the mouthful onto his plate. "This is garbage," he roared, shoving the plate away. "It's raw. Are you trying to poison me?" The steak was a perfect medium rare, a warm, rosy pink from edge to edge. Everyone could see it. Lena looked at the plate. She looked at him. For the first time, a flicker of something other than professional calm entered her eyes. It was not fear. It was a deep, profound weariness. "I can have the cook put it back on the grill for you." "I don't want it back on the grill," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. The water glass jumped. "I want a new steak, and this one is going to be free. For my trouble." This was the goal. The entire performance had been building to this. The complaint about the coffee, the trip hazard, the feigned outrage over a perfectly cooked meal. It was all a cheap grift, a power play to get a free meal and assert his dominance. Lena's spine straightened. There was a line, and he had just crossed it. I can't do that, sir, she said, her voice still quiet but now with a core of steel. You'll have to pay for your meal. The diner held its breath. The quiet waitress had finally pushed back. Grimes's face turned a shade darker, a blotchy, unhealthy purple. His smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure fury. He had been publicly denied. The audience was watching. He had to reassert control. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was shorter than Arthur, but he used his bulk to loom over Lena, trying to intimidate her with his physical presence. Are you refusing a customer? He snarled, jabbing a thick finger in her face. I used to be a cop. I know how things work. People like you do what you're told. Arthur's hand slowly clenched into a fist under the table. The knuckles went white. He could feel the old instincts stirring, the cold, clean rage that had once been his closest companion. It whispered to him, a siren song of easy, violent solutions. It would take him 2 seconds to cross the room, 1 second to break the man's jaw, another to ensure he never spoke above a whisper again. But he had made a promise, to Lena, to himself. A promise of a quiet life. He held himself in check, his control an iron cage around the beast inside him. He trusted Lena. He knew the strength she possessed, the strength that had nothing to do with muscle and bone. He would let her handle this as long as she could. He would honor her agency. But his vigil became sharper, more intense. He was no longer just watching. He was waiting, poised on the knife's edge between peace and war. Lena did not flinch from Grimes's glare. She stood her ground, a small island of dignity in his storm of rage. I am asking you to pay for the food you ordered, she repeated, her voice unwavering. If you don't, I'll have to call the owner. Grimes laughed, that same ugly, grating sound. The owner? I'll eat the owner for breakfast. He looked around the diner at the faces of the other customers. He saw their fear, their discomfort, and it fueled him. He was in complete control. He was the wolf, and they were the sheep. You know what your problem is? He said, leaning in until his face was inches from hers. You have no respect. You think because you're pretty, you can get away with anything. His eyes raked over her, a slimy, possessive appraisal that made her skin crawl. But you're just a waitress, a nobody. Serving people like me is all you'll ever be good for. The insult was personal. It was designed to wound, to strip away her professional armor and expose the person beneath. Old Man Hemlock, the professor, cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in the charged silence, it sounded like a gunshot. That's quite enough, sir, he said, his voice thin but firm. You've made your point. Now either pay the lady or leave. Grimes whirled around, his fury finding a new target. What did you say, old man? You want some of this too? Mr. Hemlock shrank back in his seat, his small act of courage extinguished by the sheer venom in Grimes's voice. Grimes turned back to Lena, a triumphant sneer on his face. See? He seemed to say, no one will help you. You are alone. It was then that Sal, the cook, emerged from the kitchen. He was holding a heavy cast-iron skillet, his knuckles white around the handle. Hey, Sal said, his voice a low growl. You heard the man. Pay up and get out. Now. Grimes looked at Sal's broad chest, at the skillet, and for the first time, a flicker of calculation entered his eyes. This was a physical confrontation he might not win so easily, but his ego would not allow him to back down. Or what? He taunted. You gonna cook me something else, fatso? He needed to regain the upper hand to end this on his terms. He needed a final act of humiliation, something that would leave no doubt as to who was in charge. His eyes fell on the pot of clam chowder Lena had just prepared for Mr. Hemlock's late-night snack. It was sitting on the counter, waiting to be served. An idea, ugly and brilliant, bloomed in his mind. He would make her serve him. He would make her crawl. "Fine," he said with a sudden chilling calm. "I'll tell you what. I'm feeling generous. I'll forget about the steak. Just bring me a bowl of that chowder. On the house, of course. For my emotional distress." Sal hesitated, looking at Lena. Lena gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Just get him out. That's all that mattered now. Diffuse the situation. Let him have his petty victory. Sal grunted and went back to the kitchen. Lena picked up a bowl and a ladle. Her hands were shaking now, just slightly. The adrenaline, the sustained pressure, was beginning to take its toll. She ladled the thick, creamy soup into the bowl. She picked up a tray, placed the bowl on it, and turned to face her tormentor. And that is when it happened. As she walked the few feet from the counter to his table, he watched her, a predator's smile playing on his lips. She was doing what she was told. He had won. He waited until she was right in front of him, until the warm, savory smell of the chowder filled the air between them. Then his boot shot out. It wasn't a trip. It was an attack. A deliberate, malicious act of violence. The toe of his heavy boot connected squarely with her shin. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot up her leg. Her knee buckled. The tray tilted. And the bowl of clam chowder seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. The crash was deafening in the silence. Lena landed hard on her knees, the impact jarring her teeth. The hot soup soaked through her uniform, a searing, sticky heat that clung to her skin. The pain was immediate, a deep, angry burn. But it was nothing compared to the humiliation. She was on the floor, at his feet, covered in food, and he was laughing. He reached down and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons. He hauled her slightly upright, forcing her to look at him. Clumsy, he sneered, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty. "You should watch where you're going." The room was a vacuum. The air had been sucked out of it, replaced by a thick, suffocating dread. Every person in the diner was a statue, frozen in a tableau of shock and horror. The young couple stared, their mouths agape. Sal stood in the kitchen doorway, the iron skillet hanging limp in his hand, his face a picture of impotent rage. Mr. Hemlock had his eyes closed, as if he could will the scene away. They were all witnesses, and they were all helpless. Lena looked up at Grimes. Her eyes were clear. There were no tears. That, more than anything, seemed to break the spell of her composure. The armor had cracked, not into tears, but into a stillness that was more profound than any outcry. It was the stillness of a soul that has endured too much, a quiet, absolute knowledge that this moment too would pass. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, and this was just another scar. Grimes, however, saw only weakness. He saw the absence of tears as a final, infuriating act of defiance. He tightened his grip on her arm, wanting to see her cry, wanting to break her completely. "What's the matter?" he taunted, his voice a low, vicious growl. "Cat got your tongue?" And then came the sound. It was not a loud sound. It was the simple, unremarkable scrape of a wooden chair leg against a linoleum floor. But in the dead silence of the lamplight diner, it was a thunderclap. Every head turned, as if pulled by a single string. They turned toward the corner booth, the one with the cracked red vinyl. Arthur was standing up. He rose not with a sudden burst of anger, but with a slow, deliberate calm that was far more terrifying. He unfolded his large frame with an economy of motion, a coiled grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. He placed his paperback book neatly on the table, aligning its spine with the edge. He placed a $5 bill next to it, enough to cover his coffee and a generous tip. Then he turned his head and looked at Grimes. It was not a look of anger. It was a look of utter finality. It was the look a geologist gives a rock formation just before it is dynamited into dust. It was a look of pure, dispassionate assessment, followed by a decision. The air in the room changed. It was a physical shift, as palpable as a drop in temperature. The thick, cloying atmosphere of fear that had emanated from Grimes suddenly dissipated, drawn away as if by a powerful vacuum. And in its place, a new kind of pressure began to build, a cold, heavy presence that emanated from the quiet man in the work clothes. Grimes felt it first, a prickle on the back of his thick neck, a sudden, inexplicable chill. He was still holding Lena's arm, still looming over her, but his position of dominance felt suddenly precarious, as if he were standing on a trapdoor and had just heard the latch click open. He turned fully toward Arthur, his bully's instinct kicking in. He puffed out his chest, trying to re-establish his authority. "You got a problem, pal?" he blustered. "This is none of your business. Sit back down and finish your coffee." Arthur did not respond. He simply began to walk. His steps were unhurried. Each footfall was silent on the checkered floor. He moved with the terrifying purpose of a glacier, an unstoppable force that did not need to rush. His eyes never left Grimes. The other patrons saw it too. They saw the man they thought was a simple laborer transform before their eyes. The slump in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a posture of absolute command. The gentle, watchful husband was gone, replaced by something ancient and dangerous. Mr. Hemlock's eyes widened. As a historian, he had studied men of power his entire life. He had read the accounts of emperors, generals, and tyrants. And he recognized the look in Arthur's eyes. It was the calm, absolute certainty of a man who had never, not once in his adult life, entered a conflict he was not certain of winning. Arthur stopped about 10 feet away from Grimes. The space between them crackled with energy. He spoke. His voice was not loud. It was quiet, almost conversational. But it cut through the silence of the diner like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and sharp and cold. It carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "Let go of my wife." The words hung in the air. 3 simple words. My wife. The realization dawned on Grimes's face, a slow, ugly wave of confusion, then disbelief, then a dawning, sickening horror. This large, quiet man was her husband? The thought was so absurd, so far outside the narrative he had constructed in his head, that he almost laughed. The mousy little waitress was married to this lumberjack? But the laugh died in his throat, because he was looking into Arthur's eyes, and what he saw there was not the anger of a jealous husband. It was something much colder, much older. It was the utter lack of emotion that precedes a truly terrible act. Still, his ego, the bloated, insecure thing that drove his every action, would not let him back down. He tightened his grip on Lena, using her as a shield. "Your wife?" He sneered, though his voice had lost its booming confidence. It was thinner now, brittle. She should have said something. Maybe she likes a man who takes charge. Arthur's expression did not change. He took one more slow step forward. "I will not say it again." There was no threat in the words. It was a simple statement of fact, a promise. And in that moment, everyone in the diner understood that whatever happened next would be the direct and irreversible consequence of Grimes's next action. The choice was his. For a long, stretched-out second, Grimes's pathetic pride warred with the primal, instinctual fear that was screaming at him to let go, to run. Pride won. He gave Lena's arm a vicious shake. Or what? Arthur's head tilted just a fraction of an inch. A flicker of something that might have been disappointment crossed his features. It was the look of a man who had offered a simple, peaceful solution and had been refused. The time for words was over. To understand the silence that followed, the profound and terrible stillness that settled over the lamplight diner, you need to understand who Arthur really was. His name wasn't always Arthur. In another life, a lifetime ago, they called him the Architect. He had not been a kingpin in the traditional sense. He was not a man of gaudy suits or bloody knuckles. He was an artist, and his medium was power. He built empires. He ran the city's underworld not with fear, but with logic. His organization was a marvel of efficiency, a complex and beautiful machine where every gear turned in perfect harmony. Loyalty was his currency, and information was his weapon. He was a legend whispered in back rooms and police precincts. A ghost. There were no photographs of him, no records. He had built a fortress of anonymity around himself. His soldiers were not thugs. They were accountants, lawyers, union foremen, and city officials. His battles were not fought in alleys with knives, but in boardrooms with leveraged buyouts and whispered secrets. He could ruin a man's life without ever raising his voice. He could dismantle a rival's entire operation with a single, well-placed rumor. He ruled with a simple, inviolable code: you protect your own. Betrayal was the only unforgivable sin. Under his protection, his people thrived. Their families were safe. Their children went to good schools. He was not a good man, not by any conventional measure, but within the dark confines of his world, he was a just one. But the machine he built had one fatal flaw. It was designed to protect against threats from the outside. He had never anticipated a betrayal from within. His right-hand man, a man he had loved like a brother, sold him out. An ambush, not for him, but for his family. It was a message, a power play from a rival family who knew they could never touch the architect himself. Arthur, he was not Arthur then, had been delayed in a meeting. He arrived home to the scent of cordiet and the deafening silence of a house that should have been filled with laughter. His wife, Elena, and his 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, were gone. The grief did not break him. It hollowed him out, and into that hollow space rushed a cold, pure, diamond-hard rage. The architect vanished. In his place was a hunter. For 6 months, a quiet, methodical war was waged in the city's shadows. It was not a war of bullets, but of disappearances. The rival family was not destroyed. It was erased. Their assets vanished. Their political connections evaporated. Their key men simply ceased to exist, one by one, without a single body ever being found. Finally, he found the traitor, the man who had been his brother. He did not kill him. He did something far worse. He took everything from him: his money, his name, his family's safety, and left him alive, a penniless, haunted man in a world that no longer knew him. A ghost, just like the man he had betrayed. When it was over, there was nothing left. The rage was spent, leaving only the vast echoing emptiness of his loss. His empire was dust. His name was a ghost story. He had won the war, but he had lost the world. He burned everything: his identity, his money, his past. He became Arthur, a man with no history. He took a job in construction, embracing the simple, honest ache of physical labor. He found a strange solace in building things, in creating order from chaos with his own 2 hands. He lived like that for 5 years, a monk in a monastery of his own making, a ghost haunting the edges of a life he no longer knew how to live. And then he met Lena. She was a witness in a minor workplace intimidation case he had been peripherally involved in. The foreman on a job site was a bully, a man much like Grimes, who was shaking down the younger workers. Lena, who worked in the site's temporary office, had seen it all. She was the only one with the courage to speak up. Arthur had watched her give her statement to the investigators. She was terrified. Her hands trembled. But her voice was steady. She spoke the truth, quietly and clearly, even as the foreman glared at her from across the room. In her quiet strength, in her refusal to be broken by a loud, cruel man, he saw an echo of the life he had lost. He saw a decency he thought had vanished from the world. He started coming to the diner where she worked part-time. He didn't speak to her for a month. He just sat in the corner booth, watching her, learning the rhythms of her kindness. He saw how she slipped an extra biscuit onto Mr. Hemlock's plate, how she spoke gently to a distraught mother with a crying baby, how she moved with a quiet grace that seemed to hold the noisy, chaotic world at bay. One night, he finally spoke to her. He asked her about the book she was reading. Their courtship was a slow, quiet thing, a conversation built over weeks and months. He learned about her own past, the abusive relationship she had fled, the reason she guarded her heart so carefully. And she learned about him, or at least, the man he was now. The quiet, gentle man who listened more than he spoke, whose eyes held a sadness she instinctively understood. He never told her about the architect. That man was dead and buried. When he asked her to marry him, he made her a promise. "I can't give you a fancy life, Lena," he had said, his big, calloused hands holding hers. "But I can give you this, a quiet life, a safe one. No more noise, no more ghosts. I promise, you will never have to be afraid again." That promise was the foundation of their world. It was a sacred vow. And in the middle of the lamplight diner, a cheap bully named Grimes was forcing him to break it. Back in the diner, the moment stretched, thin and taut. Grimes shook Lena's arm again. "Or what?" Arthur did not answer the question. He didn't need to. He moved. It was not the lunge of an angry man. It was the precise, fluid motion of a predator. He closed the 10 feet between them in what felt like a single, silent step. Before Grimes could even register his proximity, Arthur's hand was on his wrist. Not grabbing, not striking. Simply, there. Arthur's thumb found the nerve cluster on the inside of Grimes's wrist. He applied a gentle, almost imperceptible pressure. Grimes's entire arm went numb. A jolt of pure, white-hot agony shot from his wrist to his shoulder. His fingers, which had been clamped onto Lena's arm like a vice, sprang open of their own accord. He gasped, a pathetic, strangled sound, his face contorting in a mask of pain and disbelief. Arthur's other hand gently took Lena's arm, and he drew her behind him, placing his body between her and the threat. It was an instinctive, protective gesture, as natural to him as breathing. He looked down at Grimes, who was now cradling his wrist, his face pale with shock. "You put your hands on my wife," Arthur said, his voice still terrifyingly calm. "You terrified her. You humiliated her. And you did it for fun." He paused, letting the indictment settle in the silent room. "You think power is about being the loudest person in the room. You think it's about making people afraid. You are wrong." Arthur took a step closer, and Grimes, the big, blustering ex-cop, instinctively took a step back, stumbling over his own feet. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted with dizzying speed. "Now," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound more menacing than any shout. "You are going to apologize." Grimes stared, his mind struggling to catch up. The pain in his wrist was a throbbing, insistent reality. The man in front of him was not a construction worker. He was something else. Something he had only ever seen in the terrified eyes of old-time criminals when they spoke of certain legends. I, Grimes stammered. You will get on your knees, Arthur instructed, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. You will look my wife in the eye, and you will apologize for your behavior. This was the ultimate humiliation. Far worse than a punch in the face. It was a complete and total dismantling of his ego in front of the very audience he had tried so hard to dominate. No, Grimes whispered, a last desperate act of defiance. I won't. Arthur nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. Very well. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, old-fashioned flip phone. Not a smartphone. A burner. The kind of phone that couldn't be traced. He flipped it open and dialed a single number from memory. It rang once. Silas, Arthur said into the phone. His voice was still quiet, but it held a new tone, the tone of a commander issuing an order. The Lamplight Diner. Now. He closed the phone and put it back in his pocket. He looked at Grimes. You had a choice. You chose poorly. An uneasy minute passed. The only sound was Grimes's ragged breathing and the ever-present hum of the refrigerator. Lena stood behind Arthur, her hand resting on his back, feeling the solid wall of muscle beneath his shirt. She was shaking, but not from fear anymore. It was something else. Awe, and a dawning, terrifying understanding of the man she had married. The little bell above the door jingled. 2 men entered the diner. They were nothing like Arthur. They wore immaculate dark suits, tailored to fit their athletic frames. They were young, sharp-eyed, and moved with a quiet, predatory confidence. They looked like lawyers, or perhaps investment bankers. But their stillness held a different kind of promise. A promise of absolute, unflinching competence. They scanned the room, their eyes missing nothing. Their gaze passed over the shocked patrons, over Lena, over the mess on the floor. It settled on Arthur. They both gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of their heads, a sign of deep, ingrained respect. One of them, Silas, a man with cold blue eyes and prematurely graying hair at his temples, looked at Grimes, who was still cradling his injured wrist. Arthur, Silas said, his voice a smooth, low baritone. Is this the problem? This is the problem, Arthur confirmed. The second man, Marco, who was broader and had a faint scar bisecting his left eyebrow, stepped forward. He did not look at Grimes. He looked at the floor. He made a mess, Marco observed, his tone one of mild disapproval, as if critiquing a poorly executed work of art. Grimes stared at the 2 newcomers, his face a mess of confusion and terror. Who were these men? What was happening? The situation had spiraled completely out of his control. He was no longer a participant. He was a piece on a board, and the game was one he didn't understand. Arthur turned his attention away from Grimes, as if he were no longer relevant, and looked at Lena. His eyes softened, the coldness vanishing, replaced by that familiar, aching tenderness. Lena, he said softly, what do you want to happen now? The question hung in the air. He was giving her the power. He was not here for his own vengeance. He was here for her. He was an instrument of her will. The entire terrifying apparatus that was now silently assembling in the diner was at her command. This was her moment. The moment to reclaim her voice. Every eye in the room was on her. Lena looked at Grimes. She saw him for what he was. Not a monster. Not a powerful man. Just a pathetic, frightened bully, cowering in the face of a power he could not comprehend. He was small. He was insignificant. Hitting him. Hurting him. would be like striking a child. It would accomplish nothing. She thought about what she truly wanted. Not revenge, not retribution. Understanding. She wanted him to feel, just for a moment, the helplessness and humiliation he inflicted on others so casually. She wanted him to learn. She found her voice. It was stronger now, clear and steady. "I want him to clean it up," she said. The simplicity of the request was stunning. Arthur looked at her, a flicker of immense pride in his eyes. He had known. He had known the depth of her character. He turned to Silas. "You heard her. Get him a mop." Silas nodded. He walked behind the counter, found the janitor's closet, and emerged with a bucket and a mop. He filled the bucket with hot, soapy water. He placed it on the floor in front of Grimes. "On your knees," Silas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Clean it." Grimes stared at the bucket as if it were a venomous snake. This was impossible. This was a nightmare. "I'm not—" He began to protest. Marco took a single step forward. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Grimes. And in that look was the promise of a world of pain, delivered with quiet, professional efficiency. Grimes's defiance crumbled into dust. Slowly, his face burning with a humiliation so profound it was almost a physical pain, he sank to his knees. His creaking joints protested. He picked up the mop. His hands, unaccustomed to such work, fumbled with it. And he began to clean. He mopped up the spilled chowder, the sticky, cooling liquid smearing on the floor. He picked up the broken shards of the ceramic bowl, his thick fingers clumsy. The patrons of the Lamplight Diner watched in stunned silence. This was not the justice they had expected. It was not bloody or violent. It was something far more potent. It was a perfect, poetic reversal. The bully was on his knees, cleaning up the mess he had made, forced into the very position of servitude he so despised. When the floor was clean, Silas took the mop and bucket from him. "Now the apology," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Grimes remained on his knees. He looked up, not at Lena, but at the floor in front of her. He mumbled something incoherent. "Look at her," Arthur commanded. Slowly, painfully, Grimes lifted his head. His eyes met Lena's. For the first time, she saw not cruelty, but a raw, naked shame. He was broken. I'm sorry," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Lena simply nodded. It was enough. Arthur looked at Silas and Marco. "Take him outside. I want to know everything about him. Where he works, where he lives, who he owes, who owes him. I want to know every ugly little secret he has. I want a full schematic." The architect was giving an order. Silas and Marco each took one of Grimes's arms. They lifted him to his feet as if he weighed nothing. They were not rough, but their grip was inescapable. They began to walk him toward the door. As they passed Arthur's table, Silas paused. "What about the company he works for?" Silas asked. "Sterling Security?" Arthur considered this for a moment. "It's a failing enterprise. Over-leveraged, poor management. Buy it." Silas nodded as if his boss had just asked him to pick up milk. "And his employment?" "He is to be demoted," Arthur said, his eyes finding Grimes's one last time. "To the lowest possible position. I want him on a permanent night shift, guarding something empty, something forgotten. I want him to have a lot of time to think." He then turned his attention to Mr. Hemlock, the old professor. "Sir," Arthur said, his voice now respectful, "I noticed this man caused you to spill tea on your book. May I see it?" Mr. Hemlock, startled, handed over the book. It was an old, leather-bound volume on Roman history. Arthur examined the stained page. "This is a first edition, isn't it? It's ruined." He turned to Marco. Find another copy, whatever the cost. Have it delivered to this gentleman's home tomorrow. He handed the book back to the professor. And please, add the price of the book, plus damages for the disrespect shown to an elder, to Mr. Grimes's tab. Silas and Marco escorted the now catatonic Grimes out of the diner, the little bell above the door giving a final, cheerful jingle. The crisis was over. A profound silence remained, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of fear, but of awe. Then, slowly, the young man in the couple's booth began to clap. Just a few hesitant claps. Then his girlfriend joined in. Then Sal, the cook, started clapping, banging his spatula against the pass-through. Soon the entire diner was filled with applause. It was not for the violence, but for the quiet, meticulous, and absolute delivery of justice. Arthur ignored it. He only had eyes for Lena. He walked to her, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft again, all the steel gone. "Did he burn you?" She shook her head, though a red, angry patch was visible on her stomach where the soup had soaked through. "I'm okay, Arthur. I'm okay." He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of ceramic from her hair. His touch was feather-light. "I broke my promise," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I brought the noise into your life. I am so sorry." Lena put her hand on his cheek. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time she saw all of him, the quiet husband, the gentle giant, and the sleeping king he kept hidden away. And she was not afraid. "You didn't bring the noise, Arthur," she whispered. "You made it stop." Mr. Hemlock approached their table, his eyes shining with an academic's appreciation for a masterfully executed lesson. "Forgive me for intruding," he said, "but I have studied power my entire life. Some men wield it like a cudgel, all brute force and terror. Others wield it like a shield to defend and protect. But you, sir, you wield it like a scalpel. You didn't just defeat that man, you dissected him." Arthur simply nodded, accepting the assessment. He turned back to Lena. "Let's go home." He helped her gather her things, his large hand a comforting presence on the small of her back. As they walked to the door, the owner of the diner rushed out. "Lena! Arthur! Please! From now on, you and your family, you never pay for a meal here again. Ever." Arthur paused. He looked at the owner, then at the other patrons, who were all watching with expressions of gratitude and respect. He saw a community that had been terrorized and was now safe. "Thank you," Arthur said. And it was more than just for the offer of free food. It was an acceptance of their place within this small, warm world. They stepped out into the cool night air. The street was quiet. Silas was waiting by a sleek black car. "The acquisition of Sterling security is in motion," Silas reported. "And we have Mr. Grimes's preliminary file. It's extensive. Multiple complaints of harassment, extortion when he was on the force. He has a gambling problem. He owes money to some very unpleasant people." Arthur nodded. "Pay his debts?" Silas looked surprised. "Pay them?" "All of them," Arthur confirmed. "I don't want him beholden to anyone but us. His life belongs to me now. He is my project. He is going to learn empathy, even if it takes the rest of his miserable life." He opened the car door for Lena. As she slid in, she looked at him, her husband, the man she thought she knew. "The architect," she said, the name a whisper on her lips. She had heard the name before, in hushed tones from old-timers in the diner, a boogeyman from the city's past. Arthur did not deny it. He got into the car beside her. "That man is dead, Lena." "Is he?" she asked softly, looking at his calm, resolute face. He took her hand. "He is." but his ghost still remembers how to protect the people he loves. Months passed. The Lamplight Diner thrived. It became known as a place of quiet safety, a haven. Lena, no longer just a waitress, became a partner in the business, her confidence blossoming. She still moved with grace, but now there was a new authority in her step, a new light in her eyes. One evening, a late delivery truck arrived. The driver was a tired-looking man in a rumpled uniform. It was Grimes. He was thinner, his face drawn and weary. The bluster was gone, replaced by a permanent expression of exhausted resignation. He hauled crates of produce into the diner's kitchen, his movements slow and methodical. He did not look at Lena. He did not look at anyone. He did his job, got a signature, and left. Lena watched him go. There was no triumph in her heart, only a quiet, somber pity. Later that night, as Arthur sat in his usual booth, waiting for her shift to end, she slid in across from him. She caught him watching her with that same soft, unguarded look. She smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "If you look at me like that again," she murmured, her voice full of love and a newfound strength. Arthur's hand covered hers on the table. He knew the rest of the sentence, and for the first time, he truly believed it.